Home invasion while asleep. I've always felt safe in my little neighborhood. It's quiet, with friendly neighbors, and nothing ever really happens. I live alone in a small house, and while it's not anything fancy, it's home. Every night, I have this routine. I double-check all the windows, make sure the doors are locked, and set the security system before heading to bed. I've never thought much of it, just a habit. But lately, I've felt uneasy, like someone's watching. It's nothing I could really explain, just random creaks in the night or a strange feeling when I'm alone in the house. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, it's just me in this quiet neighborhood. But one night, I woke up feeling strange. I couldn't put my finger on it. Nothing seemed out of place. But something wasn't right. I told myself I was being paranoid, and eventually went back to sleep, but the unease stuck with me the next morning. When I got up, I noticed something odd. One of the kitchen chairs was pulled out, just slightly. I hadn't used the kitchen the night before, so I was sure I hadn't left it that way. I brushed it off. Maybe I'd bumped it earlier and didn't notice. But as I walked through the house, I found something else. One of the windows was unlocked. I never leave windows unlocked, especially not at night. Panic set in. I quickly checked the rest of the house, but nothing else seemed disturbed. No broken locks, no missing items, just that window. My brain started spinning. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it, though that didn't sound like me. I tried to remember if I heard anything last night, but all I could recall were the usual creaks of the house settling. I convinced myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the day's events in my mind, trying to figure out if I was overreacting. Then I remembered. I had security cameras. I set them up a while back, but barely checked them unless I was away. I decided to take a look, more to ease my mind than anything else. I started scrolling through the footage, and there it was. Around 3 a.m., someone was in my house. My stomach dropped. I watched in horror as a figure moved through my living room. They walked slowly, deliberately, as if they knew exactly where they were going. They didn't touch anything, didn't take anything. The most chilling part? They stopped right outside my bedroom door and just stood there for minutes, staring at the closed door before turning around and walking out of view. I couldn't breathe. Someone had been inside my house, standing outside my bedroom while I slept. I was terrified, but also confused. How had they gotten in? Why didn't they steal anything? And most terrifying of all, why were they just watching? My mind raced with questions, and sleep was the last thing on my mind. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I would say. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was taken. Would they even believe me? I felt helpless, paranoid, checking every door and window every few minutes. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The next night, I tried to sleep, but every little sound jolted me awake. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint creak from the living room. My heart started racing. The sound was exactly like what I'd heard the night before. I didn't want to check, but I had to know. Grabbing my phone, I pulled up the live feed from the cameras, and there they were. The same person was standing in my hallway, directly facing my bedroom door. I froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. They weren't moving, just standing there like before. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I was paralyzed with fear. I thought about calling the police, but what if they got inside before anyone could get here? I couldn't risk it. My hands shook as I hovered over the emergency dial, but I couldn't make the call. I watched as the intruder took a step toward the door, then another. The doorknob rattled like they were testing it. I held my breath, waiting for them to push the door open, but they didn't. Just like the night before, they turned and walked away. I didn't move for what felt like hours. When I finally gathered the courage to get up, I checked the house, but they were gone. The only sign they had been there was the front door, which was unlocked. That was the breaking point. I couldn't stay there any longer. The next day, I packed what I could and left. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house. I felt some relief being away, but it wasn't complete. I still felt their presence, like they were watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that somehow they knew where I'd gone. That night, in my new apartment, I locked the door and double-checked the windows, just like I always did. As I turned to walk away, I saw it. The window I had just locked was unlocked again. I never caught them. I have no idea who they were or why they were there. I moved, tried to start fresh, but I've never felt safe again. Every night, I wonder if they'll come back. I think about how close they were, standing just outside my door while I slept, watching. And I wonder if they're still out there, watching me even now. The wrong house. I never thought I'd be the type of person to post on a horror subreddit, but after what happened, I feel like I have to share. It's been a few months, and I still haven't shaken off the fear. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever really happens. My life was pretty typical. I'd go to work, come home, relax, and enjoy the peace of my own home. It was the kind of routine you don't think much about, just another day blending into the next. But I had noticed some weird things leading up to that night. I'd hear strange noises outside my house late at night, just faint enough to brush off as the wind or animals. A local psychiatric facility had been in the news after one of their patients escaped, but I didn't think much of it. Why would I? It wasn't like anything ever happened in my neighborhood. Then, one night, everything changed. It was past midnight when I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my front door. At first, I thought it was a dream, but the banging didn't stop. Groggy and confused, I stumbled to the peephole and looked through. There was a man outside, disheveled, dirty, and pacing. He was muttering something I couldn't make out, but his voice sounded strained, desperate. He started banging on the door again, harder this time, and I heard him shout, "Let me in!" "This is my house!" My blood went cold. I froze, unsure of what to do. This man was acting like he still lived here, like this was his home. I could feel my heart racing, the thudding in my chest louder than the banging on the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I tried to explain to the dispatcher what was happening. The man was now shouting, his voice growing angrier. "You don't belong here. This is my house." Each bang on the door felt like it was shaking the entire frame. I could hear the dispatcher telling me to stay calm, that help was on the way, but the police were still several minutes out. Suddenly, the banging stopped. Through the peephole, I watched as the man stepped back from the door. He was pacing again, muttering to himself. I strained to hear, and that's when I caught him saying something strange. It was never really mine. Before he turned and walked off into the night, disappearing into the shadows. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of the man. They told me it was probably just a homeless person or someone on drugs, but their reassurances didn't help. The officer promised they'd patrol the neighborhood more often, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I barely slept that night, lying awake, staring at the front door, expecting him to return. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the man. What if he came back? What if he hadn't left the neighborhood at all? I checked the locks 100 times when I got home, but it didn't help. That night, I heard a noise coming from the backyard. My stomach dropped. I crept to the back door, my heart pounding, and peeked through the curtains. There he was, standing at the edge of my yard, just staring at the house. His eyes were locked on my window, unblinking, as if he could see me watching him. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but just as I started dialing, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness once again. The police came, searched the area again, but found nothing. They told me the same thing, probably a homeless person, maybe mentally ill. But I knew this wasn't just a random person. This man knew something about my house, the way he looked at it, the way he talked. It was like he had some kind of history with it. I became paranoid. I installed extra locks, set up security cameras, but it didn't help. Every night, I expected him to come back. I barely slept, constantly checking the footage, scanning every shadow for signs of him. The police increased their patrols, but they never saw him. It was like he only came when I was alone. Then, one night, I was watching TV when I heard it again. A faint tapping on the window. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned to look. There he was, standing just outside, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the window. He didn't say anything, just stared. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 again, but before they could arrive, he moved to the front door. I could hear him trying the handle, whispering under his breath, "I just want to come home." I didn't know what to do. I was trapped inside, listening to him mess with the lock, my heart pounding in my ears. But then, just as suddenly as he started, he stopped. I heard his footsteps fade away as he walked off into the night. The police showed up minutes later, but once again, they found nothing. Later, they told me they had identified him as a former resident of the house, a man who had recently escaped from a psychiatric facility. They assured me that he was probably far away by now, but I couldn't shake the fear. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just a single sentence written inside. "I'm still looking for my home." I moved out after that. I couldn't stay in that house anymore, not knowing if he was still out there, watching, waiting. I live in a new place now, but the fear hasn't left. Every night I find myself checking the windows, the doors, always wondering if he'll come looking for his home again. The unmarked van. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood. Nothing exciting ever really happens here. I work from home, and most days follow the same routine. Coffee in the morning, emails, a few meetings, and then I watch some TV or read before bed. My apartment building is small, just a few units, and I know most of my neighbors well enough to exchange pleasantries. Life felt predictable, safe, until I noticed the van. At first it seemed like nothing. It was just a white van parked across the street from my building. No big deal, right? But over the next few days, I realized it was always there, in the exact same spot. No one ever got in or out of it. It just sat there, like a statue, as if it was watching. The weird thing was, I'd never noticed it before, and I walked past that spot every day. I brushed it off at first, probably just a delivery van or someone's work vehicle. But as days turned into weeks, it started to bother me. Who leaves a van parked for that long without moving it? I mentioned it casually to a few neighbors, thinking maybe someone would know whose it was, but no one did. The way people responded unsettled me. They either acted like I was overreacting or shrugged it off with vague discomfort, like they didn't want to talk about it too much. That's when the van started feeling less like an object and more like a presence. Every morning, it was there. Every night, when I couldn't sleep and peeked out the window, it was still sitting there, quietly taking up space. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was faint, like footsteps outside. I froze in bed, listening. Slowly, I got up and moved to the window. The van's side door was open for the first time. I couldn't see inside. My heart started racing as I stared out, trying to make out any movement, but there was nothing. No one got out. No one got in. The door just slid shut, quietly, and then everything was still again. The next morning, the van was gone, and in its place, lying on the ground where it had been parked, was a single shoe. It looked like it belonged to a kid. I didn't know what to think. I tried telling a few friends about it, but they didn't get it. Probably just some guy living in his van, one friend said, laughing it off. Maybe he's moving stuff for work, another suggested. No one took me seriously. I started feeling isolated, like no one believed me or cared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. For a few days, the van didn't show up again, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I even looked up missing persons reports, trying to connect dots that maybe weren't even there. I found nothing, but that didn't stop my mind from spinning. Then, one evening, just as I started convincing myself I was being paranoid, it came back. The van was closer now, parked directly in front of my building. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. I waited until it was late, past midnight, before deciding to go outside. As I approached the van, I felt my stomach twist in knots. My hands were trembling. Just as I reached the front of the van, I noticed something else, a second shoe lying next to the first. Both were small, like they belonged to a child. My blood ran cold. The van was locked and no one was around. I quickly retreated back inside, heart racing, unsure what to do. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the van was gone again. It was as if it had never been there, except for the shoes. They were still lying on the pavement. Over the next few days, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept looking out the window, expecting the van to return at any moment. And then, one night, it did. I had been staring out the window, waiting. I don't know what I was hoping to see, but then I saw him. A figure was walking toward the van. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he knew someone was watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him approach. He opened the van door and placed something inside. I couldn't see what it was, and part of me didn't want to know. I should have called the police. I should have done anything, but I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, and I was frozen with fear. Before I could make a decision, the van started up and drove away into the night. I ran downstairs, desperate to see if there was any clue left behind. In the exact spot where the van had been, there was a small piece of paper, folded neatly. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and unfolded it. 2 words were scrawled in messy handwriting: "You're next." I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. Who would I even tell? The police wouldn't believe me. Days went by, and the van didn't come back, but I couldn't relax. I kept checking the street, expecting to see it again. Every creak in my apartment made me jump. I couldn't sleep. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the van to return. And then, one night, it did. This time, it was parked directly in front of my building. No more across the street. No more distance. It was right there, outside my window. I stared at it, knowing something terrible was going to happen. But what could I do? I felt trapped in my own apartment, powerless to stop whatever was coming. I haven't slept since. The van hasn't moved, and neither have I. I'm just waiting for whatever happens next. Too late to scream. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood. It's always been peaceful here, the kind of place where you don't worry about locking your doors too tightly. My job lets me work from home, so I spend most days inside, appreciating the silence. For the longest time, the solitude felt like a gift, until recently, when everything changed. I should have seen the signs. There were little things at first, things that could be explained away easily. A door that was ajar when I was sure I'd closed it, the faint creak of floorboards at night. I always chalked it up to the house settling or my own forgetfulness. It's funny how quickly you can brush off the things that don't seem to fit. But now, looking back, I realized those were the first warnings. The worst was one night hearing footsteps outside my window. It had to be my imagination, right? At the time, I didn't think much of it. I should have. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of a door handle being jiggled. Still half asleep, I tried to convince myself it was just a neighbor, maybe the wind. But the sound was persistent, and then my phone buzzed. A notification from my security app. Motion detected at front door. My heart raced as I opened the app. There, in the grainy footage, was a shadowy figure standing at my front door. They were fiddling with the lock. I froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. The figure was wearing a mask, and the way they moved, it was deliberate, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Panic set in, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. Whispering into the phone, I didn't want the intruder to hear me, though they hadn't managed to get in. The dispatcher told me help was on the way, but those minutes felt like hours. I kept staring at the screen, praying the figure wouldn't break through. Just as I heard the distant sound of sirens, the intruder disappeared from the camera feed. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone. No movement, no running, just vanished. The police arrived and searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. They reassured me it was probably just a prowler, someone looking for easy targets. "We'll patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night," they said. But even as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was over. The adrenaline was wearing off, and exhaustion was creeping in, but my mind wouldn't stop. I decided to check the security footage again, hoping it would give me peace of mind. That's when I saw it. The intruder hadn't just been at my door, they had been inside my house. The footage showed them slipping in through a back door, moving quietly from room to room. My stomach dropped as I watched them walk down the hallway, stopping right outside my bedroom door. They stood there, watching me sleep. I couldn't breathe. How could I have missed that? How could they have come so close without me hearing anything? The camera showed them creeping back outside before they started fiddling with the front door, as if they'd never been inside at all. I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, or maybe I was just seeing things. But the footage didn't lie. That person had been in my house, the police hadn't seen it, and now I was alone again. I locked every door, every window, but no matter how many times I checked, it didn't feel like enough. What if they came back? I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made my heart race. I sat in bed, clutching my phone, constantly checking the security feed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a threat. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself I was overreacting, my phone buzzed again. Motion detected at front door. My heart leapt into my throat. I opened the app, expecting to see the figure back again, but there was nothing there. The porch was empty. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like footsteps. Not outside, but inside the house. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen, moving as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every shadow felt like it was about to leap out at me. I tiptoed through the house, following the sound. But when I reached the source, there was nothing, just silence. I called the police again, sure that the intruder was still inside. But when they arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the shadows. The officer looked at me with pity, like I was losing my mind. They left, and I was alone once more. I sat in the living room, staring at the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Every creak, every rustle outside felt like a sign they were coming back. My mind was racing with questions. Had the intruder been playing with me? Were they still out there, waiting for the right moment? Or had they never even left? That's when it hit me. I never saw the intruder leave, not on the footage. Maybe they were still inside. Now, I can't sleep. Every night I stay awake, waiting for the sound of footsteps again, waiting for them to come back. Because deep down, I know they will. The roommate's secret, I wasn't planning on writing this, but I can't get it out of my head. Maybe getting it down will help me finally move on, or at least try to forget. So, here's my story. About a year ago, I moved into a new apartment after graduating college. It was a decent place for the price, and I was excited to have my own space. The only downside was that I needed a roommate to afford the rent. That's how I ended up living with Jack. He seemed normal enough, polite, quiet, didn't talk much. He was the kind of guy who kept to himself, which was fine by me. The first few weeks were uneventful. We barely crossed paths, and when we did, it was just a casual, "Hey," or "How's it going?" Then, little things started to happen. I'd hear footsteps late at night when I knew I hadn't seen Jack leave his room all day. Sometimes there was this weird smell coming from his room, like something was rotting, but I shrugged it off. People have their quirks, right? What really started to bug me was the way Jack kept his bedroom door locked. I could understand locking it when he wasn't home, but he kept it locked even when he was inside. It was strange, but I figured it wasn't my business. At least that's what I told myself. Then one night, things took a turn. It was around midnight and I was up late watching TV. I heard the door click open and Jack came stumbling in. His clothes were filthy, covered in dirt, and he looked exhausted. I asked if he was okay, and he just gave me a half-hearted, "Yeah, just a long day at work," before disappearing into his room. The lock clicked shut behind him. That night, I heard noises coming from Jack's room, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Why would anyone need to drag something around in the middle of the night? I was starting to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Things only got worse after that. Jack's behavior became more erratic. He was leaving the apartment at odd hours, always late at night, and sometimes he wouldn't come back until morning, looking just as disheveled as before. The smell from his room got stronger, and I started noticing it every time I passed his door. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was nauseating. Something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what to do. One day, Jack left for work as usual, and the smell was worse than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. So, I waited until I was sure he was gone, and I tried the doorknob to his room. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, sour, rotten, and overwhelming. Then I saw the mess. Dirty clothes were piled everywhere, and there were weird tools scattered around the floor. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach drop, was the photos. There were dozens of them, pinned up on a corkboard. They were of me, taken while I was asleep. My mind raced as I stared at the images, my face peaceful and unaware in each shot. Jack had been sneaking into my room at night, documenting everything. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I closed the door, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Jack was back. I quickly retreated to my room, trying to act normal, but I could barely breathe. Did he know I had been in there? I spent the rest of the day jumping at every sound, waiting for him to confront me, but nothing happened. Jack acted like everything was fine, as if I hadn't just discovered his sick secret. I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in that apartment another night, not with Jack watching me like that. I waited for him to leave for work again and started packing my things. I didn't care what I left behind, just my essentials. I planned to slip out before he came home, But just as I finished packing, my phone buzzed. "We need to talk. Don't go anywhere." It was from Jack. Panic set in. He knew. He must have figured out that I had gone into his room. My hands were shaking as I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I wanted to run, but if I left now, would he try to stop me? I had no idea what he was capable of. Jack came home earlier than usual that night. The moment he walked in, the tension was unbearable. He didn't say anything, didn't even look at me. He just went to his room, locked the door, and stayed there. It was like we were playing some kind of twisted game, and I had no idea what the rules were. Every minute felt like an eternity, waiting for him to make a move. The next morning, I got my chance. Jack left for work, and I bolted. I grabbed my bags and got out as fast as I could, leaving most of my stuff behind. As I walked out of the apartment for the last time, my phone buzzed again. "I'll be seeing you." That message has haunted me ever since. I moved to a new place far away from Jack, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me. Even now, months later, I find myself checking over my shoulder, locking my doors, and double-checking the windows. I don't think I'll ever really feel safe again. I don't know where Jack is now, but sometimes I swear I can still feel his eyes on me. It was just another evening after work. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and most nights I walk home alone from the office. The neighborhood is usually quiet by the time I head home. Empty streets, the occasional flicker of a streetlight, and the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the pavement. It's always been my time to unwind, letting the workday fade away with each step. But tonight, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was this strange energy in the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired from a long day. My phone had been acting up recently. Random vibrations, dropped calls, but nothing serious. Still, it nagged at me, especially when I thought about how technology fails at the worst times. As I neared my street, my phone rang. It was my boyfriend. His voice, though familiar, had a sense of urgency I wasn't used to. "Come home, now," he said, his tone low and serious. He never sounded like this before. Without thinking, I picked up the pace. There was something in his voice that pushed me forward, making me want to reach home as fast as I could. I tried calling him back to ask what was wrong, but my phone froze, refusing to dial out. The screen flickered and wouldn't respond, the anxiety slowly creeping in as I realized I couldn't reach him. The air around me felt heavier, and the street seemed darker. My steps turned into a jog, every sound magnified. The rustling of leaves, the hum of a distant car. It all felt more threatening now. By the time I reached my front door, I was out of breath. I knocked hard, maybe harder than necessary, and waited for my boyfriend to answer. The door swung open, and there he was, calm, collected, and completely confused. "Why are you out of breath? What's going on?" I stammered. "You called me. You told me to come home." He stared at me blankly for a second before shaking his head. "I didn't call you." His voice was so steady, so sure that it sent a chill down my spine. We went inside, the tension thick between us. I pulled out my phone and checked the call log. There was nothing. No missed call, no outgoing call. His number wasn't even there. The last call I had was from a coworker earlier in the day. My chest tightened as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I wasn't imagining this. I knew he had called me. "What the hell?" I muttered, scrolling through the log again and again, hoping something would change. "Maybe it's your phone acting up again," he offered, clearly annoyed but trying to keep things calm. "It's been glitchy for weeks." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His voice, the panic in it, it wasn't just a glitch. It felt real, like he knew something I didn't. I locked all the doors, double-checking the windows as I walked through the house. Paranoia settled in. Everything felt off, like someone was watching us. I couldn't stop the uneasy feeling that danger was lurking somewhere close, just out of sight. As I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was just a technical error, my phone buzzed again. My heart stopped. It was another call from my boyfriend's number. I glanced over at him. He was sitting right next to me, staring at his own phone. "What's going on?" I whispered, but my hand was already shaking as I answered. On the other end, his voice came through again, panicked, desperate. "Get out of the house. They're coming for you. Leave now." I felt my blood run cold. My boyfriend was right next to me, watching me with a mix of concern and confusion. He showed me his phone screen again. No calls, no messages, nothing. But the voice on the phone was his, distorted and frantic. "They're coming," the voice repeated. "You have to leave." I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of sick joke? My body froze with fear, the walls around me feeling closer, more oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum from the fridge made me jump. It felt like the house itself was turning against me. The call abruptly cut off, leaving only silence behind. I dropped the phone, my breath shaky. My boyfriend reached out, his hand resting on my arm. "It's not real," he said softly. "You're imagining things." But it didn't feel like I was. I could feel the danger. Something was wrong, and I couldn't explain it. Every instinct I had screamed to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I tried to calm down, telling myself over and over that it was just a glitch, some weird malfunction. My boyfriend suggested we reset my phone and we'd call the provider tomorrow. But even as we sat there, my nerves refused to settle. I locked every door and window again, my heart racing as I checked each one. The feeling of being watched lingered, like something terrible was waiting just out of reach. Then, as we sat in the living room, the phone vibrated once more, lighting up in the dark room. I stared at it, not daring to touch it. A notification popped up, missed call from boyfriend's name. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. How? How could that happen when his phone hadn't made a single call? Days passed, and the strange calls stopped. We reset the phone, and everything went back to normal. But the fear? That never left. I feel it even now, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, listening for that buzzing sound. It was just a glitch, right? Or maybe there was something more. I guess I'll never know. The vanishing neighbor. I've been living in this quiet suburb for the past 5 years. Nothing much happens here. People keep to themselves, and everyone is polite, but distant. One of the only neighbors I'd ever really spoken to was Mr. Thompson, an elderly man in his 70s. He'd always greet me with a smile whenever I passed by his house on my way to work, or when I was out for a jog. We weren't close, but after a few years of brief chats, I'd gotten used to seeing him. That's why I noticed when I hadn't seen him in days. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was on vacation or visiting family. But as more days went by, his house remained dark. No lights, no sign of life. His yard, which was always neat, started to look a little unkempt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, as I was walking by, I noticed his front door was slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. I hadn't seen anyone go in or out for days. My mind raced. Maybe something had happened to him, and no one noticed. I decided to check on him. I knocked softly at first, calling out his name. "Mr. Thompson, you okay in there?" No response. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. I should have called someone, but in the moment, I felt like I had to do something. So I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark, but nothing seemed out of place. It was eerily quiet, like time had stopped in there. Everything was neat, too neat, like he'd left in the middle of his day but hadn't returned. I made my way to the kitchen where I saw a cup of coffee on the table. It looked like it had been there for a while, cold and untouched. That's when the chill hit me. Something was definitely wrong. I called his name again, louder this time, hoping for any sign of him. Silence. My heartbeat quickened as I realized that I shouldn't be there, that whatever had happened, it wasn't good. I quickly left the house, locking the door behind me. Once I got home, I called the police to report him missing. But to my surprise, they told me someone else had already made the report that same day. The next few days passed with no news. The police did a welfare check but didn't find anything suspicious. They said they'd keep an eye out, but Mr. Thompson was still missing. I tried to go about my life as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I passed his house, it felt like the air around it was heavier, darker. I started watching his house more closely, almost obsessively, but it remained quiet. Then one night, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps outside my window. My heart raced as I cautiously peeked out from behind the curtains. And there he was, Mr. Thompson, standing in front of his house, looking just as I remembered him. Relief flooded through me at first, but then confusion. How was he back, just like that? Why hadn't anyone told me? I threw on a jacket and rushed outside, hoping to talk to him. As I approached his front door, I called out, "Mr. Thompson, are you okay? Where have you been?" The door creaked open and he stood there, staring at me. But something was wrong. His clothes were the same as when I'd last seen him, and his face was blank, almost vacant. "I don't remember," he muttered, then shut the door without another word. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. He didn't remember? What did that even mean? The whole encounter felt wrong, like something was missing. I went back to my house, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. What had happened to him? Over the next few days, I kept an even closer eye on him. Every morning, like clockwork, he would leave the house at the same time and return at the same time, always in the same clothes, with the same expression. It was like he was on autopilot, following a strict routine that didn't make sense. I tried telling myself I was overthinking it, that maybe he was just trying to get back to normal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, unable to sleep, I watched his house from my window. Around midnight, I saw his front door slowly open. Mr. Thompson stepped out and walked to the edge of his driveway, staring into the dark for what felt like forever. My pulse quickened. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront him. I walked over, calling his name, but he didn't respond. When I finally grabbed his arm, he turned to me, his eyes hollow, and said, "I was never gone." Then he walked back inside, leaving me standing there, speechless. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I was never gone. What did that mean? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I went to the police again, but they brushed me off, said Mr. Thompson wasn't missing anymore, so there was nothing they could do. Now, every time I see him, I feel like he's watching me even though he never makes eye contact. I'm starting to question my own sanity. Was he ever really gone, or am I imagining things? A few days ago, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar, just like his had been. I don't know what to think anymore. I haven't spoken to Mr. Thompson since that night, and I've been avoiding him as much as possible. But I know this isn't over. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this? Because I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened to Mr. Thompson, it's not over, and it might be coming for me next. Too late for help. I moved to a new city a few months ago. Work had offered me a great opportunity, so I jumped at it. The place I found was quiet, a bit out of the way, but perfect for someone like me who enjoys being alone. At first, it was all exciting, getting my apartment set up, exploring the neighborhood. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. It was little things at first. Every time I came home late from work, I felt like someone was watching me. At first, I told myself it was just nerves, adjusting to a new city and all that. But then I noticed him, a man standing across the street, every night, staring straight up at my apartment window. He didn't move, didn't do anything, just stood there, looking. I tried to ignore it. I figured he was just a random guy, maybe waiting for someone. But every night, I started coming home earlier, trying to avoid seeing him. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes following me. One night, I stayed late at work, hoping that maybe he wouldn't be there when I got back. But as I approached my building, there he was, closer this time, standing near the entrance. I panicked. I rushed inside, slammed the door, locked it behind me, and tried to calm down. My heart was racing, and I couldn't sleep. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but that didn't make it any easier to fall asleep. After a few nights of the same thing, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. They came, took a look around, but by the time they arrived, the man was always gone. It was frustrating, like he knew exactly when to disappear. They chalked it up to me being paranoid, said they couldn't do much if there wasn't any real threat. But how could I explain the dread that was building every night? Then, one night, it got worse. I was trying to sleep when I heard a light tapping on my window. My apartment's on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no balcony, just sheer wall outside. No one should be able to reach my window. I didn't dare look, just lay there, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep at all that night. I started losing sleep altogether. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, constantly checking my windows and doors. Work became impossible. I couldn't focus on anything except him. The man outside, who was always watching. My neighbors brushed me off when I asked if they had seen anything strange. Just a homeless guy, probably, they said, but I knew that wasn't it. The police stopped taking me seriously after a while. They were tired of my calls, and I was tired of being ignored. Every night, the man seemed to get closer. I caught glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, standing near the back entrance of my building, by the alley. One night, as I was about to enter my apartment, I froze. He was standing right in front of my door. He didn't move. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring. My legs felt like lead, and my throat tightened up so badly I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Slowly, I backed away, but as I did, I heard the creak of a door behind me. It hit me then. He was already inside. I bolted, but no matter where I turned, it felt like I was running in circles. I thought maybe I could make it out, but then I heard the door slam behind me, trapping me inside my own apartment. My chest tightened, and I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I managed to dial the police. As the call connected, I looked up. I saw his reflection in the window. I don't remember much after that, honestly. Everything happened so fast. There was no escape. I was trapped. I couldn't get away. Every breath felt like it could be my last, and I was sure that this was the end. There was a moment of silence after that, like everything just stopped. I tried to convince myself it was over, that maybe he had left. But then I heard it, a soft creak from behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know he was still there, watching me from the shadows. My phone buzzed in my hand, but I was too scared to check it. I knew there was no point. No help was coming. I haven't slept since that night. I don't know if he's still out there, watching. Maybe he's inside. waiting for the right moment to finish what he started. I try to keep telling myself it's over, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still here, lurking somewhere in the darkness. If you've read this far, just be careful. Pay attention to the small things, because you might not realize you're being watched until it's too late. I wish I had been more careful. Maybe then I wouldn't be stuck in this nightmare, wondering if tonight's the night he comes back. I've always been a bit of a night owl. Living alone means I can set my own schedule, and most nights I'd find myself scrolling through my phone or watching something until the early hours. My apartment was in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing ever really happened around here, or at least that's what I thought. Lately, though, things started feeling off. Maybe it was the creaking floorboards or the occasional faint knock on the door, but it never felt serious enough to worry about. I brushed it off. Who wouldn't hear noises living in an old building? Then came the first phone call. It was late, and I was half asleep when my phone lit up. Block number. Annoying, but not unusual. I answered, but there was nothing. Just silence. I waited, said, "Hello?" and still nothing. After a few seconds, I hung up and went back to bed, thinking it was a glitch or maybe some prank. No big deal. But it didn't stop there. The calls came again the next night, and the next. Always the same. Block number, complete silence. It started to feel less like a coincidence and more intentional. Who keeps calling at 2 a.m. just to stay silent? Still, I told myself it was probably just some bored kid with a spoofed number. I blocked it, thinking that would end it. It didn't. The calls kept coming, even after I blocked the number. The silence on the other end felt wrong, like whoever was on the other side was listening but didn't want to say anything. I started to feel a little paranoid. I checked my locks more often, found myself glancing out the window late at night. It was probably just nerves, right? I mean, what could actually happen? Then one night, the phone rang again. This time it woke me up, the screen lighting up the dark room. I answered it, annoyed and tired, but there was something about that silence that made my skin crawl. I didn't hang up right away like I normally would. I just lay there, listening to the quiet, and for the first time, I had this gut feeling that someone was watching me. I can't explain why, but the thought stuck, making it impossible to sleep. After a few nights of restless sleep and more of the same calls, I decided to change my phone number. Maybe that would stop it. For a while, it worked. The calls stopped, and I finally felt like I could relax. Life started to feel normal again. But just as I was starting to let my guard down, my phone rang. Block number. I couldn't believe it. How did they get my new number? My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. I didn't answer right away, but the ringing wouldn't stop. After the fourth or fifth ring, I picked up, hoping it was just a mistake, a glitch, anything but what it really was. Silence. Just like before. That's when the fear really set in. I started to wonder how much this person knew about me. Were they watching me? Did they know where I lived? It wasn't just phone calls anymore. I started to notice things around my apartment that were slightly off, like objects I was sure I'd left in one place, only to find them somewhere else. A faint creaking sound in the hallway when I knew I was alone. Each night, I lay awake, dreading that moment when the phone would ring again. Then one night, it got worse. I woke up around 3 a.m. and reached for my phone, only to find it wasn't on my nightstand. Confused, I checked the floor, thinking maybe it had fallen. But when I got up to look around, I saw it lying in the hallway. The hallway. I hadn't left it there. My heart sank. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had moved it while I slept. I grabbed my phone, locking all the doors, but I knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows, it all felt like a sign that whoever had been here could come back. I wasn't safe, not here. I couldn't stay. The next day, I decided to move. It felt like my only option. I packed up my things, found a new place across town, and hoped that leaving my old apartment would put an end to this nightmare. For the first few nights in the new place, it was quiet. No calls, no strange noises. I actually started to feel like maybe I'd escaped it. Maybe it had all been in my head. But then the phone rang again. Blocked number. I didn't answer this time. I couldn't. My hands were shaking, and I felt that same cold dread creeping up my spine. I stared at the phone, listening as the ringing stopped, only for it to start again minutes later. Even after moving, they found me. I told myself it had to be a prank, something random, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Even in my new apartment, I found myself jumping at shadows, checking my phone constantly, wondering if someone was still watching me. Every night, I expected to hear that knock on the door, the creak of the floorboards. It was like they were always one step ahead, always knowing more than I did. Now, I live in constant fear. Every unknown number that pops up on my phone makes my heart race. I can't help but wonder, did they know more than I thought? Were they really in my home, or was it all some elaborate trick? I don't know if it's over or if it ever will be. It started like any other evening. I'd just finished up a late shift and was driving home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood. I remember thinking about how peaceful everything felt, almost too peaceful. It was one of those nights where the air feels a little heavier, where the silence makes you more aware of every little sound. There had been some news about a dangerous criminal on the loose recently, but that seemed far removed from my life. I didn't live in a bad area, and crime wasn't something I worried about too often. But as I drove through the empty streets, something felt off. I noticed there was barely any traffic, and the few cars I did see seemed to move oddly, like they were watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks after a long day. But then, as I turned onto my street, a police car pulled up behind me, flashing its lights. My heart jumped. What could I have done wrong? I pulled over, confused and a little anxious. Before I even had a chance to gather my thoughts, two officers were approaching my car, their hands resting on their guns. They didn't even greet me. One officer barked, "Get out of the car, hands up!" The aggressiveness in their voices sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a routine stop. I did as they said, stepping out slowly with my hands raised. They told me to kneel on the pavement, and that's when I knew something was seriously wrong. One officer muttered to the other, "Matches the description perfectly." I tried to speak, to tell them there had been a mistake, but they cut me off before I could finish a sentence. "We're looking for a dangerous fugitive," one of them said. "You fit the description." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to explain, tell them my name, my address, anything, but it was like they didn't even hear me. The officers were on high alert, treating me like I was armed and ready to fight back. Then came the kicker. "We're looking for a guy named Jack Sawyer. Is that you?" I had never heard that name in my life, but my voice came out shaky as I said, "No, that's not me. You've got the wrong person." They weren't buying it. One officer snatched my wallet from my pocket, pulling out my ID to run it through their system. I was placed in the back of their cruiser while they checked my information. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how this could have gone so wrong. I hadn't done anything, and yet here I was, being treated like a criminal. What if they didn't believe me? What if they decided I was guilty just because I looked like someone else? In the car, I overheard one officer casually talking about the dangerous fugitive, describing him as violent and unpredictable. I felt sick. Was this really happening? Were they confusing me for someone capable of hurting people? What if they never realized their mistake? I imagined being locked up, accused of crimes I hadn't committed, maybe even getting hurt because of this mix-up. By the time we arrived at the station, I was a wreck. The cold, sterile walls of the interrogation room felt like they were closing in on me. An officer came in, flipping through a file, barely glancing at me. They asked me about every detail of my day, where I'd been, who I'd talked to, even what I'd had for lunch. I stumbled over my words, not because I had something to hide, but because I was so terrified that anything I said might be twisted or taken the wrong way. It felt like no matter what I said, they wouldn't believe me. They mentioned security footage, some vague description that apparently matched mine, but none of it made sense. I was trapped in this nightmare, and every second that passed made me more certain that I wasn't going to get out of this easily. Then, just as things seemed like they couldn't get worse, the officer with the file got a call. He stepped out of the room without a word. I was left sitting there in silence, every horrible scenario running through my head. What if they decided I was guilty after all? What if this mistake ruined my life? After what felt like hours, another officer came in, much calmer than the others. "You're clear to go," they said, almost casually, like the whole thing hadn't been a big deal. "Sorry for the confusion. You matched the description." That was it. I was free to leave, just like that. But there was no real apology, no explanation that made me feel better about what had just happened. As I walked out of the station, the night didn't feel peaceful anymore. The world outside felt dangerous, hostile. All I could think about was how easily this could have gone wrong, how one mistake could have changed my entire life. The drive home was different. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those flashing lights again. The fear didn't go away once I was back in my house. In fact, it's still with me now every time I see a police car or hear about someone getting stopped. It's terrifying to think that something as simple as being mistaken for someone else could have ended so badly. I try not to dwell on it too much, but the truth is, I don't feel safe anymore. Not really. Because who's to say it won't happen again? Every time I drive home now, I find myself holding my breath when I see a cop car. It doesn't matter that I'm innocent. The fear is still there, and it's not going away. That's the part that scares me the most. The locked car. It was one of those nights where everything seemed normal. I had stayed late at work, finishing up a few tasks, and decided to make a quick stop at the grocery store on my way home. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered under the dim streetlights. It was quiet, and the cool air made me feel anxious to get home. I parked my car a bit away from the entrance, not really thinking much about it. I was tired and just wanted to get this done quickly. As I got out, I noticed a car parked several spots away with the engine still running. There was no one around, but I brushed it off, figuring someone might be waiting for a friend or grabbing something inside. Still, there was something about it that stuck with me, a small detail that I couldn't shake. I should have listened to that gut feeling. Inside the store, I hurried through the aisles, picking up just the essentials. When I came out, the lot was even quieter than before. I walked to my car, balancing the grocery bags in one hand while I fished for my keys. My fingers slipped, and the keys fell onto the seat as I closed the door. That awful sinking realization hit me immediately. I had just locked myself out. I stood there for a moment, annoyed at my carelessness. I pulled out my phone and called roadside assistance. They told me it'd be at least an hour before someone could get to me. Great. I leaned against the car, mentally kicking myself for this stupid mistake. That's when I glanced over and noticed the car from earlier. The engine was off now, but the man inside was still there. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his face barely visible in the low light. My first instinct was to ignore him. People wait in their cars all the time, right? But something about the way he was sitting, almost too still, made me uneasy. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Minutes passed, and I kept stealing glances in his direction. Finally, he opened his car door and started walking towards me. My heart jumped. I kept my eyes on my phone, pretending not to notice him. Maybe he was just going to his own car, but then he stopped right in front of mine. "Hey, you need some help?" His voice was too cheerful for the situation. He grinned, his eyes not quite matching the smile on his face. "No, I'm good, thanks. I already called for help," I said, hoping that would be enough to make him leave. He didn't budge. "Roadside assistance? That takes forever. I can help you now." He gestured towards my car like he was some kind of expert. Something about the way he hovered made my skin crawl. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine, really." I kept my voice calm, but inside, I was starting to panic. His presence was too close, his smile too wide, like he wasn't taking no for an answer. I shifted my weight, subtly glancing around. The lot was still empty, no one in sight. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "Come on, it's easy. I could break into this car in less than a minute." He chuckled like it was a joke, but my stomach twisted. He wasn't here to help. I felt trapped. My phone was still in my hand, and I quickly pretended to text someone, hoping he'd get the hint that I wasn't alone. But his smile faded, replaced by something darker. "Look," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm fine. I just need to wait a little longer. Thanks for the offer." He stepped back, pulling a crowbar out of his jacket. "Easy as pie," he said with another grin. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. I needed to get away from him, but where? Running wouldn't do any good. The parking lot was too empty, too open. Then, headlights cut through the darkness. Another car entered the lot, slowly making its way toward the store. Relief flooded over me, but it was short-lived. The man didn't move. He just stared at the approaching vehicle, like he was weighing his options. Then he looked back at me, his grin fading into something cold and knowing. He wasn't in a rush. The car honked as it passed, but it didn't stop. It parked at the far end of the lot, too far to be of any immediate help. That was when I knew I had to act. With the brief distraction, I bolted towards the grocery store entrance, my legs shaking with every step. I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. I didn't dare look back. I made it to the door, my heart pounding out of my chest. I found the night security guard and explained everything in a rush. He glanced out at the man still standing by my car, his hand resting on the crowbar. The guard calmly radioed for backup, and as if sensing the change, the man turned and walked back to his car. He drove away slowly, almost like he was disappointed that it was over. I thought it was done, that I was safe. But as I sat inside, waiting for roadside assistance, I saw his car again. This time, parked across the street, his silhouette barely visible. He was watching me. Eventually, I got home safely, but the fear didn't leave. I keep thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't run when I did. Now, I carry something with me every time I go out at night, just in case. Because I still see his face in my nightmares, and I wonder if one day I'll see him in real life again. I've driven home late at night more times than I can count. I'm used to the dark, empty highways, the distant glow of headlights from cars far ahead or behind. Last night felt different, though. I had just finished visiting a friend and was heading back on a route I knew well. It's a quiet, rural stretch of road, usually peaceful, but something felt off as soon as I hit the highway. The darkness seemed thicker, the road more deserted than usual. I brushed off the unease, blaming my tiredness. After all, it was past midnight and I just wanted to get home. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another car on the road. But after several miles, I realized the car wasn't passing me. It was staying right behind me, matching my speed. A slight chill crept up my spine, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just going in the same direction. No big deal, right? I switched lanes, hoping they would pass. They didn't. The car stayed right behind me, not too close, but close enough to be unsettling. That's when the dread began to set in. I thought about taking the next exit but decided against it, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But as I took a right turn onto a quieter road, the car followed. My heart rate picked up. At this point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I took another turn, an odd one that only locals would know. A winding road that was almost a detour. The car followed. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining it. This car was deliberately following me. I tried to stay calm, but my mind raced with possibilities. Were they planning to rob me? Run me off the road? Was this someone I knew? Maybe someone I had unknowingly angered? Every scenario that flashed through my mind made the situation worse. I sped up, taking sharp turns and switching lanes again, but no matter what I did, the car stuck with me. It was like a shadow, always there. I debated calling the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? "Hi, there's a car behind me, and I think they're following me?" It sounded ridiculous, and I didn't even have proof of any crime yet. Maybe it was all in my head, and this was just a coincidence. But my gut told me otherwise. I tried calling a friend for some kind of reassurance, but of course, the call didn't go through. No signal out here. Great. Now I was really on my own, on an empty road, with a car tailing me and no help in sight. After what felt like an eternity of this cat and mouse game, I spotted a gas station up ahead. My heart leaped with a mix of hope and fear. I didn't know what I'd do if the car followed me into the gas station, but at least there would be lights and people, or so I hoped. I signaled and took the turn into the station. For a brief moment, the car slowed down behind me, and then it sped up and zoomed past, disappearing down the road. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The sudden disappearance of the car left me bewildered. Was it all a misunderstanding? Was I overreacting, or had I just narrowly avoided something much worse? I parked and stayed in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finally got out, legs shaking, and walked inside the gas station. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain what had happened. I probably sounded paranoid, especially since there was no car in sight anymore. No one would believe that a random car following me could be terrifying, but in that moment, it was the most real thing I had ever felt. I stood by the counter for a while, glancing nervously out the large glass windows, half expecting the car to come back. But it didn't. The road outside was quiet, the station lit up and peaceful. It felt like the world had gone back to normal, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't completely safe yet. After a few minutes, I decided to get back on the road. The drive home was slower this time. I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror, expecting those headlights to appear again. Every set of headlights in the distance made my heart race. Was it the same car? Was someone still following me? But each time, it was just another driver going about their night, unaware of the terror I had just experienced. When I finally reached my street, I spotted a car parked down the road. It wasn't the same one that had followed me, but seeing it parked there, just sitting in the dark, reignited all the fear I thought I'd shaken off. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for a few more minutes, staring at the parked car, too scared to move. Eventually, I got out, rushed inside, and locked the door behind me. Even then, I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about that car. Who were they? What did they want? I'll never know. Maybe it was nothing, but deep down, I feel like I narrowly avoided something terrible. I'm sharing this here because I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Even though I'm home, safe, I still can't explain why they followed me for so long. I don't know if I overreacted or if I'm lucky to have gotten away. Trapped on the train. I take the late night train almost every day. It's quieter, fewer people, no crowds pushing in. After a long day at work, it's the only time I get to sit back and breathe. That night was no different. Just me, exhausted, sitting in the near-empty car, looking forward to zoning out for the ride home. There were no other passengers when I boarded, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. I was relieved, really. I found a seat near the back, away from the doors, put on my headphones, and leaned back. It had been a draining day, and I let the gentle rocking of the train lull me into a light sleep. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the usual hum of the train or the distant murmur of passengers, but a heavy, unnatural quiet. I took out my earbuds and looked around. I was still in the last car, but I wasn't alone. A man was sitting across from me, a few seats away, staring. I hadn't noticed him before. He wasn't dressed like someone just getting off work. His clothes were wrinkled, a little too worn, and his eyes were locked on me. Something about the way he was sitting, so still, made me uneasy. I tried to shrug it off as just another weird public transport moment, but his gaze never wavered. I glanced at my phone. It was much later than I thought. The train was still moving, but there was no sign of anyone else. That's when I decided to move. I needed to get to another car, somewhere with more people. I got up casually, as if I wasn't bothered. But when I reached the door leading to the next car, it wouldn't open. I tried again, pushing the button, but it stayed locked. Panic started to rise in my chest. The man hadn't moved, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. I was stuck. I went back to my seat, pretending to check my bag or look for something, trying to avoid eye contact with him. Maybe if I ignored him, he'd lose interest. But no. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly stood up. He began walking toward me. It wasn't fast, not aggressive, but something about his slow, deliberate steps made my heart race. I considered yelling for help, but the partition to the driver was closed and I knew no one would hear me. My phone had no service underground. I was trapped in this car with him and no one knew. I backed up to the far end of the car as far as I could go. The man kept walking, getting closer with each step. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront him? Should I run? But where would I go? He stopped just a few feet away from me and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made your skin crawl, like he knew something I didn't. My stomach turned as I tried to think of what to do. The tension was unbearable. Just then, the train jolted, signaling we were approaching a station. Relief washed over me. I stood up, ready to bolt the moment the doors opened. The man just stood there, watching, but not moving. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open. For a few horrifying seconds, I was frozen, not sure if he would follow. Then, my legs finally moved, and I rushed out, practically stumbling onto the platform. As I stepped off, I felt something, a light brush, like someone's hand grazing me. But I didn't stop to look. I just ran. Once I made it onto the platform, I turned around. The man was still standing at the edge of the train door, watching me, that same eerie smile on his face. The doors closed, and the train moved away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in my chest. I was safe. Or so I thought. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. It was over. I rationalized that it had just been some weird guy on the train, nothing more. I reached for my phone to text a friend and tell them what happened, but it wasn't in my pocket. Neither was my wallet. I started frantically checking my jacket, my bag. Nothing. In that moment of panic when I brushed past him, he had taken my stuff. My phone, my wallet, all gone, just like that. Fear gripped me again. How close had he been? How had I not noticed? I felt sick to my stomach, realizing just how vulnerable had I had been. I started walking home, my mind racing, but something else was bothering me. It wasn't just my phone and wallet. I reached up to my neck, and my heart dropped. The necklace I always wore, a simple silver chain my mother gave me, was gone too. He had taken that, and I hadn't even felt it. How long had he been watching me? Did he know more about me than I realized? I rushed home, looking over my shoulder every few steps. Even after I locked the door behind me, the feeling didn't go away. I felt like he could still be watching, waiting for another chance. I sat down to write this post, hoping getting it all out would help, but it hasn't. I still feel like I'm being watched, like any moment he might come back for something else. I keep checking the door, making sure it's locked, but even then I can't shake the feeling that he knows where I live. I used to think working the night shift at a corporate office would be easy. It's quiet, calm, and there's no one around to bother you. I took the job to help pay some bills, figuring I could handle the late hours. My shift started at 9 p.m. and ended around 6 a.m. The building itself was pretty typical. Bright fluorescent lights that flickered sometimes, and empty hallways that echoed with every footstep. It wasn't long before the emptiness started to feel unsettling. At first, things were fine. I'd bring some snacks, get work done, and pass the time listening to music. Occasionally, the janitor would pop by, and the security guard made his rounds. He seemed friendly enough, tall, a bit older, and always with a small smile. He'd chat briefly, ask how my night was going, stuff like that. But over time, his questions became more personal. "You live alone, right?" he'd ask, or "Don't you ever get scared being here all by yourself?" I shrugged it off at first. Maybe he was just being friendly. But one night, as I was getting ready to leave, he stopped me at the door. "You should be careful when you leave at night," he said with a weird smile. I laughed it off, but the way he said it stuck with me. Over the next week, things started to get stranger. I'd look up from my desk and there he was, standing at the far end of the hallway, just staring. It wasn't like he was making his rounds. It felt like he was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but it happened again and again. Every night, he seemed to show up out of nowhere, always at the same spot, just watching. His questions became even more intrusive. "Why do you work so late? Does anyone know you're here?" I started feeling more uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. That all changed one night when I took a break and stepped out for a bit. When I came back, something was off. My coffee mug had moved slightly, and one of my desk drawers, which I was sure I had closed, was now open. Nothing was missing, but it didn't feel right. The next time I saw the guard, something in his demeanor had shifted. He didn't just stand at the end of the hallway anymore. He started showing up right behind me. It felt like he had been there for a while, just waiting. His smile wasn't friendly anymore. It was cold, unsettling. I didn't confront him then, but I started locking my office door whenever I left. Still, every morning I'd find it unlocked again. That's when I decided to set up a hidden camera on my desk. Just a small, cheap one, hidden behind some paperwork. The first few nights, nothing happened. But on the third night, as I watched the footage, my heart sank. At around 2:30 a.m., the security guard entered my office. He sat down at my desk, rummaging through my belongings. He lingered over a photo I kept on my desk, a picture of a close friend. He held my pen, the one I used every night, for what felt like minutes. Then, he just sat in my chair, staring at the computer screen. I was terrified. I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. He had keys to every door in the building. What if he had been watching me all this time, waiting for the right moment? I didn't feel safe. The next night, I went to work, but this time I was ready to confront him. Around 3 a.m., he came around, like he always did. This time, I locked eyes with him. I could feel the tension. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me like he always did. My heart raced. Finally, I asked, "Have you been in my office?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, too close, and whispered, "You're the only one here at night. Anything could happen, and no one would know." His smile was cold, predatory. I grabbed my things and left the building. I didn't even stop to see if he was following me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I drove away, his words echoed in my head. I couldn't stay there anymore. The next morning, I sent an email to HR telling them I was quitting. I didn't explain why. I just couldn't bring myself to talk about it. Even after quitting, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every time I left my apartment, I'd look over my shoulder, expecting to see him. I started changing my routine, walking different routes, anything to shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. A few weeks later, I was getting ready to leave my apartment when I noticed something. Down the street, parked a little too close, was a car. His car. It was facing my apartment, just sitting there. I froze, unsure if I was imagining it. My hands were shaking as I got into my car and drove away. I didn't see anyone in the driver's seat, but that didn't stop the fear. I haven't seen him again since that night, but sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched. The stranger at the window. I've always been cautious, but not paranoid. At least, I wasn't until I moved into this new neighborhood. It's a quiet place. Too quiet, honestly. I live alone, which never used to bother me, but lately, something feels off. Maybe it's the way the street seems completely deserted after 8 p.m., or maybe it's that abandoned house across the street. You know the type. Boarded up windows, overgrown yard. No one's lived there for as long as I can remember. I never thought much of it, but recently, I've been getting this weird feeling that I'm being watched. At first, I ignored it, thinking I was just adjusting to living alone. Then one night, as I was closing my blinds, I noticed something. In the window of that empty house, there was a shadow, a figure, just standing there, staring straight at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, but that feeling didn't go away. The next night, I saw it again. Same spot, same window, same still figure. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a squatter had broken in, or maybe it was just someone passing through. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I was overreacting? So I left it alone, but that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that figure looking at me. On the third night, I woke up suddenly. My room was completely silent, but I had this overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. I sat up, glanced toward the window, and there it was, standing in the window of the abandoned house again. Only this time, it was different. This time, I could tell that the figure was looking directly at me. My stomach dropped. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just staring back, frozen. That was when the real fear started to creep in. Who was this person? Why were they just standing there? I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just some random squatter. Something about the way they stood there, so still, so deliberate, felt wrong. The next day, I tried asking around. I went to a couple of neighbors, hoping someone would know something about the house or the person inside, but no one did. In fact, most people told me the house had been empty for months, maybe even years. No one had seen anyone go in or out. That just made it worse. If the house was truly vacant, then who was I seeing every night? I called a friend, hoping they'd give me some kind of reasonable explanation. Maybe I was imagining things. But they brushed it off, saying I was probably tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe them, but every night the figure was there again. The friend's dismissal made me feel more isolated. No one believed me, and I started doubting myself, but the fear wouldn't leave. I started avoiding the windows at night. I made sure all my doors were locked, double-checked the windows, but I couldn't shake the unease. One evening, I finally worked up the courage to walk closer to the abandoned house. I thought maybe I could confront whoever it was, or at least get a better look. But when I got close, the figure was gone. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. I tried convincing myself I was overreacting, but that night, the figure wasn't at the window anymore. It was standing outside, across the street, facing my house. I don't think I've ever felt more afraid in my life. There was something terrifying about the stillness of it, the way it just stood there, watching. Then came the footsteps. I heard them outside my window, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but as they grew louder, I realized they were real. I rushed to check the locks again, making sure everything was secure. My heart was racing, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped, and I dared to peek outside, but no one was there. Just an empty street and the figure, still standing. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront them? Call the police? What if they disappeared again by the time anyone arrived? Every option seemed terrible, and the fear kept growing. I felt trapped, like no matter what I did, it wouldn't make a difference. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. No footsteps, no noise, just gone. But I knew it wasn't over. The tension didn't leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, even if I couldn't see them. Since then, my life hasn't been the same. I keep trying to convince myself it was all in my head, that it was just some random person passing through or maybe a squatter. But that doesn't explain why they were always there, always watching. I'm more cautious now. I check my windows and doors religiously, but I can never fully relax. It's like a part of me is always waiting for that figure to return. I tell myself it was just a strange coincidence, but I don't really believe it. Some nights I still wake up with that same feeling, the sense that someone is standing just outside, watching me. It's been a while since I've seen the figure, but I know it's not over. Deep down, I can't shake the feeling that one day, they'll be back. Maybe they never really left. Word count, 1,000. The wrong rideshare. I still can't believe this happened to me. I'm writing this here because I've been replaying it over and over in my head, and it's driving me crazy. I need to share this somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone avoid a similar experience. It was a typical Friday night. I had been out with some friends at a bar downtown. Nothing crazy, just a few drinks and laughs. By the time I decided to head home, it was already close to 1 a.m. I've always used rideshare apps, never had a problem before. I opened the app and ordered a car like I usually do, but this time, something felt off. The app was glitching. It took longer than usual to find a driver, and when one finally showed up, the car's license plate didn't quite match the one in the app. It was close, off by a number or two, but I shrugged it off. I was tired, a little buzzed, and just wanted to get home. I figured maybe it was a mistake, so I got in the car. The moment I sat down, I knew something wasn't right. The driver didn't greet me, didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the road. I tried to convince myself that it was just late. Maybe he was tired, but the silence was unnerving. No small talk, no nothing. The car started moving, and I noticed we weren't going in the direction of my apartment. At first, I thought maybe he was avoiding traffic, but then we veered way off the expected route. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the app wouldn't refresh. I asked the driver, "Hey, is this the right way?" No response. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I asked again, louder this time, "Sir, are we going the right way?" Still nothing. That's when panic started to set in. I texted my friend with my location, but the message wouldn't send. My phone still had signal, so why wasn't it working? I tried to remain calm, telling myself that I was overreacting, but my heart was racing. The car suddenly turned off the main road into an area I didn't recognize, an industrial zone with no lights, no people, nothing. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. I asked him again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you stop the car, please?" Silence. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Child locks. My stomach dropped. We slowed down as we approached a red light. I knew this was my only chance. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I scrambled to unlock the door manually, and by some miracle, it opened. Without thinking, I threw myself out of the car. The impact was rough. My knees hit the pavement hard, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm as I rolled onto the street. I heard the car's tires screech as it sped off. I looked up, dazed and bleeding, and saw the taillights disappearing into the distance. For a second, I couldn't move, just lying there, trying to process what had just happened. Then, pure adrenaline kicked in. I dragged myself to the nearest gas station, which, thankfully, wasn't far. I burst through the doors, breathless and trembling. The attendant barely looked up from his phone. I was bleeding, my voice shaky as I asked to use his phone. My own was dead. 1% battery had been enough to call 911, but not enough to get through. The attendant handed me his phone without much concern, as if seeing a frantic, bleeding woman was a regular occurrence. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. I explained everything, still shaking. The officers listened, but I could see it in their faces. This was going to be hard to follow up on. The rideshare info had disappeared from my app, and I hadn't gotten a good look at the driver's face. He hadn't spoken a word the entire time. They took my statement and offered to drive me home, but I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness. What if they never found him? As we were leaving, one of the officers mentioned they'd been getting reports of similar incidents. People being picked up by drivers whose info didn't match the app, disappearing into the night. They had no leads. I realized then that I might not be the first person this had happened to. Back at my apartment, I couldn't calm down. Every little noise outside made me jump. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see that car pull up outside. I didn't feel safe anymore. Not in my home, not anywhere. The driver was still out there, and every time I saw a car that looked remotely like his, my heart would race. I became obsessed with checking the news, waiting to see if someone else had been taken, if the police had made any progress. Weeks passed, and nothing happened. But then, I saw an article. A woman had gone missing not far from where I had jumped out of the car. The details were vague, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it him? Did he find someone else after me? I don't use rideshare apps anymore. I can't. Every time I think about it, my stomach knots up, and I'm filled with that same dread I felt that night. I was lucky, but others might not be. I still wonder if he's out there, picking up passengers. I'll never know if they'll catch him, or if he'll find me again. I never thought I'd be writing something like this on Reddit, but after what happened, I feel like I need to tell someone. Maybe it's a way to process everything, or maybe I just need to feel like someone is listening. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone minds their own business. It's always been that way. Everyone goes about their daily routines, and nothing ever really happens here. My house is in the middle of the block, and my next door neighbor is a quiet guy who I barely know. He's the type who keeps to himself, doesn't socialize, and I never thought much of it. But a couple of weeks ago, I started noticing strange things, small details that didn't seem right. At first, it was just noises at odd hours. I heard furniture being moved around late at night, which was weird, but I figured maybe he was redecorating or something. Then, there were lights on at 3 a.m., and every once in a while I'd see someone leaving his house who I didn't recognize. None of it seemed like a big deal at the time, so I just brushed it off. That was until I heard a loud thud one night. It was different, louder, heavier. It woke me up, and I stayed up, watching from my window. But I didn't see anything, just shadows moving inside the house. It gave me a bad feeling, but again, I told myself I was probably overthinking it. A few nights later, the noises got worse. This time, it sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I could also hear faint voices, muffled, but the tone didn't sound right. It wasn't like someone was having a normal conversation. There was an urgency, a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. That's when I started to really pay attention. I noticed more people coming and going from his house, always at night. They didn't stay long, and they never looked like they belonged there. One night, I overheard what sounded like an argument. It was faint, but I could hear a slam, followed by hurried footsteps. Something clicked in my mind, and I became convinced that something illegal was happening. It wasn't just weird, it felt dangerous. I called the police to report it, telling them about the strange noises and the people coming and going. But when the officers arrived and spoke to my neighbor, they didn't seem too concerned. They left after just a few minutes, and I was left feeling more helpless than before. The next night, as I was watching the house again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A car passed by, and in the brief flash of its headlights, I saw a figure standing at the window, watching me. I froze. It wasn't just the figure itself, but the way they stood there, almost like they knew I'd been keeping an eye on them. It felt like a warning. My anxiety grew worse after that. The noises became more frequent, and the strangers seemed more ominous. I tried talking to my neighbor the next day, just to feel things out, but he barely said a word. He acted like I didn't exist, which only made things feel more unsettling. That night, I saw a van parked outside his house. It had tinted windows, and several men emerged carrying what looked like large, heavy bags. They disappeared inside the house, and I stood there, heart pounding, watching it all unfold. I was too scared to confront them, but I knew something wasn't right. I called the police again, this time more desperate, explaining that it felt more serious than before. The officer on the phone reassured me that they had been monitoring the situation for weeks, telling me not to worry. But that response left me with more questions than answers. Monitoring? For weeks? If they were aware of something, why hadn't they done anything? Later that night, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. A young woman stumbled out of the house, looking terrified. Before I could react, she was pulled back inside. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just witnessing something criminal. This was something far, far worse. I spent the next few days in a state of constant fear. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios, and I even considered leaving town for a while just to escape the feeling of dread. But I couldn't shake the thought that something terrible was going to happen soon. One night, as I was watching again, the van returned. The men were carrying more bags, but this time, something spilled out. Something pale. Something limp. A hand. That was the moment I completely lost it. I called 911 frantic, demanding that they come immediately. But the operator seemed confused, telling me that the police were already on the scene. From where I was, the house looked quiet, like nothing was happening. Panic took over, and I felt completely alone, unsure whether I could trust anyone at this point. Just as I was about to give up, I heard loud banging coming from the house, followed by police sirens. The authorities stormed in, and in that moment, I realized that I had been living next to something horrific all along, and I hadn't even fully understood it. The next day, the news broke that my neighbor's house had been part of a massive human trafficking ring. The police had been watching it for months, waiting for the right moment to move in. I was shaken to my core. How had I lived so close to this without realizing it? Could I have done more? I felt guilty for not acting sooner, for not pushing harder when I knew something was wrong. The house is empty now, but the unease hasn't gone away. As I walked by it yesterday, I saw something that sent chills down my spine, a small, forgotten shoe on the front porch. It reminded me that not everyone made it out alive. I keep thinking about how fragile safety really is. We like to believe that we're safe in our quiet neighborhoods, but the truth is, horror can be right next door, and we wouldn't even know it. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. I recently moved into a quiet neighborhood, hoping to give my child a better, safer environment. It's been peaceful here, almost too quiet. Every night after my son falls asleep upstairs, I unwind with a cup of tea in the living room. My new house is a bit isolated, far from the main road. At first, I enjoyed the solitude, but something about being so alone out here has always unsettled me. That night, everything seemed normal. The house was silent, my son fast asleep. I was watching a movie when I thought I heard something outside. A faint noise. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Still, I glanced toward the window but saw nothing. I brushed it off, trying not to think much of it. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't shake. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., when I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't just a casual knock. It was insistent, almost demanding. I froze. No one ever visits this late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart started racing, and a wave of dread washed over me. I tiptoed toward the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked outside. There was a man on my porch, well dressed but standing far too close to the door. His posture was strange, like he was listening for movement inside. My gut told me something was wrong. He called out, "My car broke down, I need to use your phone." His voice was off, too eager, too persistent. He repeated himself, but I stayed still, holding my breath. There was no way I was opening that door. Backing away from the window, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want him to know I was home, but I also didn't want to wake my son. The man knocked again, harder this time. He wasn't leaving. I started to panic, trying to think of what to do next. Minutes passed, but the man remained on my porch, pacing back and forth. The knocks grew louder, and then I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. The door handle jiggling. He was trying to get inside. I grabbed my phone and crouched behind the couch, my hands shaking as I dialed 911, whispering. I told the dispatcher what was happening. She assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. The knocking continued, relentless, and then I heard a faint scraping sound. He was trying to pick the lock. My mind raced as I kept checking the clock. It had been over 10 minutes, and the man was still there, growing more agitated. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave the house, not with my child upstairs, and I certainly couldn't confront him. All I could do was wait, hoping the police would get there in time. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The scraping stopped. The knocking ceased. I cautiously peeked out the window, but he was gone. Relief started to wash over me, but it didn't last. Something felt off. I couldn't see him, but that didn't mean he wasn't still out there, lurking. Just as I was starting to calm down, a loud bang came from the back of the house. My heart nearly stopped. He was trying to break in through the back door now. I grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it in my trembling hand as I stood frozen, listening for any sound of movement. My child was still sleeping, completely unaware of the danger. I couldn't decide what to do. Should I stay quiet and hope the police arrive before he got in? Or should I try to escape? But how could I leave my son behind? My mind was racing through all the possibilities, none of them good. Another bang, this time from the front. He was relentless. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken a window. My panic set in fully as I heard police sirens in the distance, but they felt so far away. Would they get here in time? Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps running away. The sirens were getting closer, and it seemed like they had scared him off. But there was no relief, not really. I stared at the shattered window, realizing how close he had come to getting inside. The police arrived shortly after, but by the time they searched the area, the man was long gone. They found signs of the attempted break-in, scratches on the lock, the shattered glass, but he had disappeared without a trace. I spoke to the officers, describing everything I could remember, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. One of the officers mentioned that there had been reports of similar incidents in the nearby neighborhoods, men knocking on doors late at night asking for help, but always with something more sinister in mind. It didn't make me feel any safer. Even though days have passed since that night, I still can't sleep properly. Every small sound makes me jump, and I find myself double-checking the locks on every door and window. But deep down, I know it doesn't matter. The sense of safety I once had is gone. I don't know if he'll come back, or if it'll be someone else next time. All I know is that I'll never feel safe in my own home again. A deadly misunderstanding. I travel a lot for work, and to save money, I usually stay in budget accommodations like Airbnbs. Nothing fancy, just places to crash for the night. This time, I was heading to a small town, far from the city, where I found an Airbnb that seemed perfect. The price was ridiculously low, almost too good to be true, but the photos looked fine, outdated but decent. I didn't think much of it. When I arrived, the house looked a bit run down, like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. The host, an older man, greeted me at the door. He was polite, but something about him seemed off. He was fidgety, talking too fast, like he was nervous about something. I brushed it off as small-town awkwardness. I was exhausted from driving all day, so I just wanted to get inside and sleep. But as soon as I got settled in, I couldn't shake this weird feeling. The house was quiet, but I kept hearing these faint creaks, like someone was walking around. I told myself it was an old house. Old houses make noises. Still, the unease stuck with me. I must have fallen asleep for a while because the next thing I remember is waking up to a soft noise. It was so faint at first that I thought it was just the house settling, but then it grew louder, like footsteps, right outside my door. My heart started racing, and I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But then I saw it. A shadow under the door. Someone was standing right outside. I froze. My brain was screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. I just stared at the shadow, terrified of what might happen next. I thought maybe it was the host checking on something, but why would he be there in the middle of the night? I grabbed my phone to check for service. Nothing. Typical. I crept out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. My hands were shaking as I leaned toward the door to listen. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath and slowly cracked the door open, just a tiny bit. That's when I saw him, my host, standing in the hallway, holding a large kitchen knife. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled back, trying to stay quiet, but panic was flooding my body. My mind raced with thoughts. Was he planning to hurt me? Why did he have a knife? There was no time to figure it out. I had to do something fast. I quietly moved to lock the door, but it barely latched. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle, pressing my weight against it to make sure it held. I needed to hide. The only place was the bathroom connected to my room, so I darted inside and locked the door behind me. Sitting on the cold tile floor, I could hear him entering the bedroom. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, like he was searching for something. I could hear the faint tap of the knife against something solid. He was muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. My entire body was shaking. I dialed 911, whispering into the phone that someone was in my room with a knife. The operator said police were on their way, but I wasn't sure I had that much time. Suddenly, the knocking started. Soft at first, then louder. The bathroom door shook with each knock, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other side. My chest tightened. I was trapped. There was no way out. I gripped my phone so tightly I thought it would break, whispering into the receiver for the police to hurry. I could hear him talking through the door, his words slurred and incoherent. It was like he was in a trance, which only made things worse. My mind was spiraling. What if he broke down the door? What would I do? The knocking stopped abruptly. I heard his footsteps retreating. Was it over? Could I move? I stayed frozen in place, unable to trust that the danger had passed. The sirens were faint at first, but as they got closer, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe I'd get out of this. Maybe I'd survive. But just before the police arrived, I cracked the bathroom door open, only to find my host sitting on the bed, completely calm, cutting into what looked like an apple. The knife was just a kitchen tool now, harmless in his hands. He looked dazed, like he didn't even know what had happened. I didn't understand. How could he go from pounding on my door with a knife to casually eating fruit? My brain couldn't process it. The police burst into the room moments later, and I ran out of the bathroom, explaining everything as fast as I could. The host, still calm, seemed just as confused as I was. He kept apologizing, saying he didn't know what was going on. According to him, he had been sleepwalking. He claimed he'd woken up in the kitchen and grabbed the knife to cut some fruit, then somehow ended up in my room. It didn't make any sense, but the police seemed satisfied after taking our statements. Even though it was explained away, I couldn't shake the fear. I left the Airbnb immediately, not caring that I had nowhere else to go that night. It's been months since that night, and I still can't sleep properly. I wake up at the slightest noise, expecting to see a shadow at my door or hear footsteps in the hallway. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. I don't think I ever will again. I tell myself it was just a misunderstanding, but every time I close my eyes, I see that knife and wonder if I was only seconds away from something much worse. The hiker who watched. I've been hiking solo for years now, and it's always been my way to unwind. There's something calming about being out on a trail, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature. I know these trails like the back of my hand, and I never thought much about the dangers of hiking alone until a few weeks ago. I haven't told many people about what happened, but after reading a few posts on here, I realized I'm not the only one who's had an experience like this. Maybe someone can give me advice, or maybe this will just serve as a warning for others. It was a regular Saturday, and I decided to take a trail that I'd hiked dozens of times before. It wasn't too far from town, but far enough that I could go for hours without seeing anyone else. I packed a light lunch, grabbed my gear, and set off early in the morning. Everything felt normal at first. The trail was peaceful, and the weather was perfect. About an hour in, I noticed someone behind me, a guy, maybe in his 30s, with a backpack and a baseball cap. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people hike this trail. But as I kept going, I realized he was always there, just far enough back that it didn't seem like a coincidence, but close enough to make me feel uneasy. I stopped for a break, thinking maybe he'd pass me, but he didn't. He stopped too, standing there like he was waiting for me to move again. I shrugged it off and started walking, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every time I glanced back, there he was, same distance away. He never got closer, never farther. I picked up the pace a little, just to see what would happen, and sure enough, he sped up too. That's when I knew something was wrong. I thought about turning back, but I was already pretty deep into the trail, and honestly, I didn't want to make it seem like I was panicking. I figured I'd take one of the side trails coming up soon, something less used, hoping to lose him. I reached the junction and took a sharp right onto a narrower path. For a few minutes I thought I'd shaken him off, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Faint, but there. He was still following me. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I started coming up with excuses. Maybe he was just taking the same trail. Maybe I was overreacting. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something wasn't right. I pretended to take some photos of the trees, slowing down in the hopes that he'd walk past me. But when I stopped, he stopped too, keeping the same distance as always. That's when I knew. This guy wasn't just another hiker. He was following me. I started walking faster, but so did he. I took another turn, veering off onto an even more remote path, hoping to lose him in the dense woods. But minutes later, the footsteps returned, always just behind me, never too close, but never far enough to feel safe. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. The further I walked, the more isolated I felt. I hadn't seen another hiker in over an hour, and now it was just me and him, deep in the woods. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no one else around, no way to call for help, and the nearest road was miles away. I came across a small clearing, hidden just off the trail. At first, I thought it might be a good place to stop and gather my thoughts, maybe find another path out. But as I stepped into the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was an old fire pit in the center, surrounded by scattered belongings. An empty backpack, a broken watch, a single hiking boot. It looked like someone had camped here, but it hadn't been recent, and it didn't feel right. It felt like a trap, like someone had been watching this trail for a long time. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, louder now, closer than before. I didn't wait to see him. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, stumbling over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quickening as I picked up speed. I thought for sure he was going to catch me. I tripped once, nearly falling flat on my face, but I kept going. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Finally, I saw it, the trailhead, and beyond that, the small gravel road where I'd parked my car. I burst out of the trees, panting and drenched in sweat, but there was no one around, no sign of him. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the car, jumped inside, and slammed the doors shut. For a few minutes, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath, constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting him to appear at any moment. But he didn't. I drove off, trying to put as much distance between me and that trail as possible. But even now, hours later, I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched the whole time. I stopped at a gas station a few miles down the road and finally checked my phone. I had a signal again. Out of habit, I opened my GPS app and my blood ran cold. My location had been tracked. Someone had marked the trail. I haven't gone hiking alone since. Maybe it's paranoia, but I feel like he's still out there, waiting for the next hiker to wander into his path. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I take the subway late at night pretty often. It's kind of a routine for me. I work late, and by the time I'm done, it's usually well past 10 p.m. The subway is quieter then, mostly empty, and I like to zone out with music, just counting down the stops until I get home. I've never really had any issues until last week. That night started like any other. I hopped on the train, plugged in my headphones, and settled in for the ride. The car was nearly empty, just a few people scattered here and there. One guy stood out, though. He was sitting a few seats away, and for some reason, I felt a bit uneasy. I brushed it off. It's late, I'm tired, and I'm probably just being paranoid. Still, I noticed him glance in my direction a few times, which made me feel off. I didn't want to overthink it, so I just stared at my phone, trying to drown out any weird vibes. But then, he moved. He sat a couple of seats closer to me, and I could feel his eyes on me again. I could sense it, even though I wasn't looking directly at him. When he spoke, I jumped a little. I hadn't even noticed him lean in. "Late night for you too, huh?" he said. I pulled out one earbud and gave him a polite smile. "Yeah," I muttered, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. He kept talking. "You always take this line? I see you around sometimes," he added, like we were old friends. I didn't recognize him, but I nodded along, trying to keep the conversation as short as possible. Something about him was unsettling, but I couldn't figure out why. He seemed normal, but there was an edge to his friendliness that made me uncomfortable. I was polite but brief, hoping he'd get the hint and leave me alone. But then he started asking personal questions, like where I lived and if I was heading home alone. That was when my internal alarms really started blaring. His questions were casual, but there was something invasive about the way he asked them. I glanced around the train. No one else was paying attention. I didn't want to seem rude, so I gave vague answers and put my headphones back in, hoping he'd stop. But a few seconds later, I felt a tap on my shoulder. He wasn't done talking. That's when I realized this wasn't just casual small talk. He wasn't going to leave me alone. My heart started racing as he leaned in again, closer this time. He asked if I was getting off at the next stop. I lied and said yes, even though my stop was still a few stations away. His response made my stomach drop. "Good idea. It's not safe for a woman to travel alone at night," he said, his tone friendly but somehow wrong. There was something predatory in how he said it. I considered getting off early just to get away from him, but part of me was terrified he'd follow me. I started planning how I could escape. Maybe I could move to another car or pretend I was meeting someone, but every option felt risky. If I stood up, would he follow? If I moved, would it provoke him? The train was slowing down for the next stop, and I made a split-second decision. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and moved quickly toward the door. I didn't look back, hoping he wouldn't follow, but I could feel his presence behind me. As the doors opened, I heard his footsteps. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I stepped onto the platform trying to act calm, but the empty station felt vast and exposed. I sped up, hoping to lose him. His voice echoed behind me, too casual for the circumstances. "Hey, are you all right? You seem nervous." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to draw more attention to myself. I spotted a small group of people further down the platform and walked toward them, my heart racing with each step. His footsteps followed me for a few seconds longer, and I braced myself for the worst. But then, just as I reached the group, his footsteps stopped. I glanced back and he was gone. He had turned around and walked away, disappearing into the shadows without a word. I kept walking, my hands shaking. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. The whole way home, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him again. But he was gone. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. By the time I got to my apartment, my body was buzzing with leftover adrenaline. I locked the door, double-checked it, and collapsed onto my bed, trying to shake the dread that had settled deep in my chest. Was I overreacting? Had he just been a weird but harmless guy? Or was I right to be scared? I didn't know. But the way he said, "It's not safe for a woman to travel alone at night," kept echoing in my head. I can't stop thinking about it. I typed out this post to see if anyone else has experienced something similar, or if maybe I'm just paranoid. But I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible that night. I guess I'll never really know for sure. The locked basement door. I never thought I'd post here, but I need to share this with someone. A few months ago, I stayed at a friend's house while my apartment was getting renovated. The plan was simple: a few quiet days away from the chaos of workers and dust. My friend, let's call him Jake, lived alone in an old house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't creepy or anything, but you know how older houses can be: creaky floors, weird plumbing. He warned me about the basement furnace making noises sometimes, saying it was nothing to worry about. At first, I didn't think much of it. The house had a strange vibe, though. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a general sense of unease. Maybe it was the unfamiliar surroundings or just the fact that it was quieter than I was used to. The first night, I heard some strange noises. It wasn't anything major, just some faint sounds coming from the basement. I figured it was just the furnace Jake had mentioned. I tried to sleep, but something felt off. I brushed it off and eventually dozed off. The next day, I casually brought up the noises to Jake over breakfast. He laughed and shrugged. "Told you, it's the furnace. Old houses are weird like that." He didn't seem bothered at all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the noises came back, but this time they were louder. It wasn't just the usual thumps. It almost sounded like something was moving down there. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard what sounded like footsteps. I froze. I got up to check it out, but when I reached the basement door, it was locked from the inside. My heart started racing. Why would the door be locked? I didn't bother trying to force it open and went back to bed, but I barely slept. I kept thinking about those footsteps. The following day, I asked Jake if he had locked the basement door. He looked at me like I was crazy and shook his head. "Why would I lock it?" "I haven't even been down there," he said, but there was something in his voice, something that didn't sit right with me. I decided not to push it, but the feeling of unease only grew. That night, the noises were worse than ever. I heard loud thumps, dragging sounds like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. It didn't sound like a furnace at all. It sounded human. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I got up and went to the basement door again, this time determined to get in. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement was pitch black, and the second I opened the door, the noises stopped. Dead silence. I called out, "Hello?" But no one answered. Just when I was about to step inside, I heard a faint shuffling sound like something, or someone, was just behind the door. I froze, unable to move. My mind was racing. Should I go in? Should I turn around? But before I could make a decision, Jake appeared behind me, startling me so badly that I nearly screamed. "What are you doing?" His voice was tense, not at all the laid-back tone he usually had. His eyes were wide, and for the first time I felt real fear, not from the noises, but from him. I heard something," I stammered. He stepped past me and shut the door quickly. "It's just the furnace," he said, but his tone was off. He wasn't just brushing it off this time, he was defensive. Something wasn't right. I knew I had to leave. The next morning I told Jake I had to go back to my apartment early, even though the renovations weren't finished. He didn't protest much, but there was a strange tension between us. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and made some excuse about needing to meet the contractors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The entire time I was there, it felt like Jake was hiding something. I kept hearing those noises in my head, the dragging, the footsteps. I wondered if I had just overreacted or if something was actually going on down there. Now, sitting in my own apartment, I still think about that basement. I never got an answer, and honestly, I'm not sure I want one. Maybe it was just an old house with noisy pipes and a faulty furnace, like Jake said. But what if it wasn't? I haven't spoken to Jake since then. I don't know if he sensed my suspicion or if he's just been busy, but part of me is afraid to ask. What if there was something or someone down there? What if Jake knew all along? I'll never know for sure. But that locked basement door, it still haunts me. I was on a business trip just like many times before. Routine, nothing special. Meetings all day, then back to the hotel in the evening for dinner, maybe a drink at the bar. I've always been comfortable with this kind of life, solo travel, quick schedules, but something felt off this time. It's hard to explain, but there was a strange weight in the air as soon as I checked in. The hotel was fine though, pretty standard. I was tired when I got to my room, chalking up the uneasy feeling to jet lag. That night, I remember hearing some strange noises from the hallway. It wasn't anything obvious, just enough to wake me up briefly. I told myself it was probably just other guests coming back late, and went back to sleep. The next evening, after a long day of meetings, I decided to head to the hotel bar to unwind. As I sat there with my drink, I made eye contact with someone, a stranger sitting alone across the room. He gave a small nod, and before I knew it, we were talking. He said he was also traveling for work, and we quickly clicked. We talked about the usual stuff at first, travel, work, places we'd been, but something about him stood out. He seemed to know more about me than I'd let on. I brushed it off. Maybe I'd mentioned something in passing without realizing it. But then he started talking about being in town for personal reasons. He didn't go into details, and the vagueness was a little unsettling. Still, we had a good conversation overall, and before leaving, we agreed to meet again the next night at the same bar. The following evening, I showed up at the bar as planned, but he wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe he was running late. I ordered a drink and waited. After an hour, I started to feel like an idiot. I asked the bartender if she'd seen him, but she looked confused. She didn't remember anyone matching his description from the night before. That was odd, but maybe she just forgot. I started asking around, other patrons, hotel staff, but no one remembered him. It was like he never existed. I even went as far as to ask security if they could pull the footage from last night just to check. They were surprisingly accommodating. I watched the footage, and there I was, sitting alone at the bar. No one ever sat with me. The entire conversation I thought I'd had, it wasn't on the footage. Panic started creeping in. Was I losing my mind? He had been so real. I remembered every detail of our conversation, his face, his voice. How could no one else remember him? I went back to my room that night, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the stress of work had caught up to me. I was ready to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing when I opened my suitcase to grab something. That's when I saw it. Something small, something that didn't belong to me. A lighter with the stranger's initials engraved on it. I froze. There was no way that could have gotten there unless he'd been in my room. My mind raced. Had he come into my room while I was out? While I was sleeping? How? The door was always locked, and I hadn't let anyone in. I searched my room, tearing through every drawer, checking under the bed, behind the curtains. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no trace of anyone but me. I called the front desk in a panic, demanding to know if anyone else had access to my room. They assured me that no one had been inside, and no one else had a key. I tried to leave. I grabbed my things and was halfway to the door, but something stopped me. I didn't know what I was running from, but leaving suddenly felt like a mistake. What if I left and never found out what happened? What if I walked out that door and something worse was waiting? That's when the room phone rang. I stood there, staring at it. No one ever called the room phone. Slowly, I picked it up. No one spoke. All I could hear was faint breathing on the other end. My heart was pounding. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I knew then I'd been watched this whole time. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to get into my room, close enough to know every move I'd made. I hung up and sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was all some sick prank. But then I saw it. Another item in my suitcase, something that definitely didn't belong to me. It was a small notebook, the same one I'd seen the stranger scribbling in at the bar. It was filled with notes, written in a language I didn't understand, except for one line scrawled at the bottom. "I'll see you soon." I wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. I was stuck. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? "Hey, I met a guy at a bar, but now it seems like he doesn't exist, except his stuff keeps showing up in my room?" They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. Now I'm just sitting here, staring at the door, waiting. I don't know what's going to happen next. I feel like I'm being watched, even as I write this. I don't know if I'll make it out of this hotel, but if you're reading this, maybe you'll understand. If someone ever tries to make small talk with you at a hotel bar, don't. Just don't. The window across the street, I moved into my new apartment about 3 months ago. It's a small one-bedroom place, perfect for me, in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was affordable, and I thought I'd lucked out. The apartment itself was nice, but the building across the street was a little too close for comfort. I didn't notice it at first, but at night when I had my lights on, I felt exposed. The window in my living room faced directly into someone else's across the street. It wasn't a big deal at first. I tried not to think about it, but sometimes I got this odd feeling like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, who would want to stare into someone else's apartment? But one night, I saw him. A man standing by the window in the building across the street, staring directly into mine. He didn't move, didn't do anything, just stood there. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just looking out at the street. I went about my evening, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Every night, like clockwork, he was there. 9 p.m. sharp, always standing at the window. At first, I thought it was a weird coincidence, but as the days passed, it became clear that it wasn't. His gaze never wavered. He wasn't just looking out the window, he was staring right at me. It made my skin crawl, but I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if this was something serious. One night, I decided to close the curtains, hoping it would give me some peace. I sat on the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. After a few minutes, I peeked through a small gap in the curtains. My heart dropped. He was still there, staring, like he knew I was looking. It got worse. Every night, his presence became more suffocating. I tried keeping the curtains shut, turning off the lights, anything to block him out, but it didn't matter. I could feel him watching, even when I wasn't looking. It felt like I couldn't escape. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? There's a man staring at me from across the street? He wasn't doing anything illegal. He was just standing there. Still, my anxiety kept building, and one night I decided to take a picture of him as proof. I needed someone to believe me. But when I looked at the picture, his window was pitch black. No man, no staring figure, just darkness. Panic set in. Was I losing it? I knew what I saw, but now I wasn't so sure. It didn't help that none of my friends believed me. It's probably just your imagination, they'd say. But I knew something was wrong. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't relax. I felt like I was constantly being watched, even during the day. The man's gaze haunted me, even when I couldn't see him. Finally, I broke down and called the police. I told them everything, that a man was staring at me every night. They came, but of course, by the time they arrived, he was gone. They checked the building, but nothing seemed out of place. Ma'am, it's probably nothing. Maybe it's just a neighbor with a habit of looking out the window, they said. I wanted to scream. How could they not see it? I wasn't imagining things. I couldn't take it anymore. One night, I decided to confront him. I don't know what I was thinking, but I needed answers. I threw on a jacket, left my apartment, and crossed the street to his building. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached his door, I hesitated. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, but I had to know. I knocked, but no one answered. The silence was deafening. My hand shook as I tried the door handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a completely empty apartment. No furniture, no belongings, nothing except a single chair by the window, facing my apartment. That's when it hit me. He wasn't living here. He had been coming to this empty apartment every night just to watch me, for weeks, maybe months. The realization made my stomach turn. I felt sick. And then, I felt it. A presence behind me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran. I ran out of that building as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back in my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. After that, I called the police again, begging them to check the empty apartment. When they came back, they confirmed what I already knew. The apartment had been vacant for months. They didn't seem concerned. Maybe it's a squatter, they said. But I knew better. I packed up and moved out within the week. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that happened. But even now, in my new apartment, miles away from that building, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Every time I look out the window, I expect to see him, standing there, staring. It's like I can't escape it. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Or maybe once you feel that kind of fear, it never really leaves you. I don't know. All I know is that I wouldn't wish this feeling on anyone. If you ever feel like someone is watching you, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts. Because sometimes you're right.